Welcome to the Startup Leader Show, where we talk to startup founders and executives. I am your host, Lisa Dreher, and I am really excited to introduce our guest for today, Stephen Biersteker. He is an architect and associate at Thinkspace Architecture. Welcome to the show, Stephen.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for making time for this. Maybe we can start by having you give a little bit of background on yourself and then Thinkspace Architecture.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm kind of traditional architect, pretty classically trained, studied kind of undergrad in architecture, master's in architecture. Didn't kind of always knew what I wanted to do, but it kind of was the right field for me. I kind of worked in a few kind of boutique type firms, did some residential, did some kind of custom single family homes, and just felt like I wanted to do something more interesting, bigger projects, and have a bigger impact on the world. I'd always kind of been interested in sustainability personally, like through school. You learn a lot about, what buildings are doing to the environment and how we can solve that. And then when you get into the industry, there's kind of you realize that clients might not want that, even though, in school, it's all self-directed, right? So you can do whatever you want. And so my first couple of jobs, I didn't really have that exposure to sustainable projects. So when I started working for Thinkspace, one of the big things that I kind of came with and they really encouraged me to do was to say, hey, why don't you start leading our sustainability team and try and change things from the inside. So that's kind of when I started coming to Thinkspace. I've been here for about 4 years. We do a lot of different types, a lot of sector work. Our biggest traditionally is education work. So we do K-12 schools. We do post-secondary institutional schools as well. We have quite a large healthcare sector as well, and commercial work as well. We don't really touch residential. That's kind of the one thing we don't do a lot of. But yeah, that's kind of us. We're the greater Vancouver area here in Canada on the West Coast.
Got it. Got it. So is most of your work in Vancouver, or do you go nationally, or how's that?
Most of our work is in British Columbia,
Okay.
the province. We have a few projects up north in the Northwest Territories and the Yukon, but and a little bit in Alberta. But typically we kind of stay out here on the West Coast. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. So
hmm
how did you initially get really interested in that sustainability side of things from an architecture perspective?
Totally. So as I mentioned, when you're in school, you kind of learn about it. And I think for me, I just kind of assumed that I'd be doing it in my career. And I think as a student, one thing you don't really necessarily realize when you're in that kind of environment is who you become after school isn't necessarily, if you don't make a conscious decision to choose who you're going to become, you can just become whoever the firm you're working for is or does. And I kind of was in that wave for quite a while. And I don't know, I don't know exactly what the moment was, but I started kind of reading books, even general like business books, financial books, that you start hearing all these people talk about how they kind of created the life that they wanted and they pursued the things that they were interested in. And you realize, oh, maybe I should start doing that.
Yeah.
And that's kind of when professionally, I guess, I really started saying, hey, I'm going to actually try and make this thing happen for myself. So that's when I started writing on LinkedIn. That's when I started, and I used that as a tool to learn, is what it was, because I felt like I wasn't getting enough at work, because you're managing projects, you're managing people, and so this was kind of an outlet for me to start learning more about carbon specifically, and sustainable design practices.
Wow, that's great. So, as I understand it, I think Vancouver and many other cities around the world have kind of guidelines or a goal to get to lower carbon, like embodied carbon, or kind of a net zero. They all have
Totally.
these different targets. Are
Mhm.
you familiar with what Vancouver's target is right now?
To be honest, I'm not. Do a lot of work outside of the city of Vancouver.
Oh,
It's
gotcha.
interesting because Vancouver is one of the most progressive cities, well, in North America for sure, in terms of the carbon reduction strategies. I
Right.
mean, 2030 and 2050 are big targets. And the city of Vancouver just announced actually that they're planning to start taxing existing buildings who have too high of an operating greenhouse gas emissions, which is it's not unprecedented, but it's relatively unprecedented because typically municipalities just care about what you build new. And now they're starting to kind of go after existing buildings, which will be an interesting kind of transition there. We'll see how that kind of affects new building design and existing building design. We lost Lisa. We did. Anyways, what I would like to talk about is this kind of idea of operational versus embodied carbon, which Lisa kind of brought up just a few minutes ago, and this idea about regulating carbon emissions. Oh,
Yes.
you're back.
Thank you. It sounds like you were filling some dead air, so thank you for
Well,
doing that.
there was definitely some dead air in there because I was like, I think Lisa's frozen, but then I just started talking again. So there's a nice awkward pause in the middle. But yeah, I just kind of kept talking about that topic, which is this idea of the kind of operational versus embodied carbon. So
Right, right. Oh my gosh.
yeah,
So, thanks for sticking with us for those of you
no
that are
problem.
sticking with us through the hole there. In any case, I think we're all back online now, and sorry about that little hiccup there. So what I really want to jump into, and I think maybe you already covered some of this while I was trying to get reconnected. But kind of tell us a little bit about this whole idea of some of the primary considerations that are
Mm,
taken into account as you're doing sustainable design.
totally. I mean, one of the big things that I think we're really encouraging our designers and project managers to do is to make sure the projects start off on the right foot. Because one of the things that again, this comes from my history of kind of education and how we practice architecture, is a lot of times as a designer you think, when I get on that sustainable project, then I will do sustainable design. That's a really common thing because projects are labeled that way. They're certified a certain way, or the client's really ambitious. But I think the reality is that every architect needs to do this on every project. It's not, there
Mm,
shouldn't be this kind of like sustainable versus not sustainable project. So what we're encouraging our project managers and designers to do really is to start right away by setting targets. So that can mean like, hey, this is a benchmark for embodied carbon that we want to meet on this project. And what it does is it helps kind of clients, and it also helps designers to at least start getting that into their heads about what these benchmarks might be, what could influence that. It doesn't mean on the first project you're going to, reduce your embodied carbon by X, but what it does mean is it starts that conversation about learning and understanding what that means.
right. Do you have clients actually proactively requesting this at this point, or is it more you're encouraging them to take a look at it?
At this point for us, we're encouraging it to happen.
Right.
There are some clients that are proactively doing it. Typically, well, I mean, it's more, institutional clients, like bigger
Mhm.
institutional clients. At least the school districts in our area haven't started doing that yet. I'm sure it will come down. And then it's projects that are in the city of Vancouver, because the city of Vancouver has embodied carbon regulations that are coming out this year and next year, to start just calculating it and then reducing it by a certain percentage every year. So a lot of this stuff is municipality driven. So if it's in the municipality, then people are asking. If it's not, then it's either you get some really innovative clients, like universities typically are the
Right.
first ones to kind of say, hey, we want to be the leaders on this. Let's pay the extra money. And because it does take extra consultants to measure and to reduce for a lot of
Mhm.
these things. So yeah, that's what we're seeing.
Yeah. So, what are some of the ways that you are actually building that sustainability into the architectural designs? What are some of the aspects or
In terms
products
of
or
like the
solutions?
right. Yeah, totally. I mean, so I talked to you about this a little bit before the show, but there's this idea of how important context is and how every project's different. And one of the things that I talk about on LinkedIn, where I write a lot, is about the importance of electrification, and everyone talks about this idea of electrification.
Hmm.
Here in BC, that's extremely true because we have a very clean grid. It's all hydropower, or mostly hydropower. So one big thing we do is we try and get air source heat pumps on most of our projects. We're also in a climate where we don't go below, well, it's like -10 outside right now, but that's almost unprecedented. It doesn't get very cold here as well. So that is the one of the perfect solutions for this kind of climate and where we're at. Um, One of the other things that we are typically looking at is just reducing energy use. That
Yeah.
could be envelope upgrades. That could be simple things like shading. There's a lot of things that they've been talked about for years. In
Right.
BC, we don't see a huge benefit from solar shading because we don't have the extreme heat in the summer. And to
Hmm.
be honest, when you add the shading, it's typically metal, which increases the embodied carbon impact. So it's almost like, is there a point to doing it? And that's what we're trying to move towards, is more what's called a whole life carbon perspective.
Right.
So traditionally you'd say if it saves energy, it's good, right? Doesn't matter what you do, just save energy. And what we're realizing is that if you save energy but you increase the amount of embodied carbon, maybe that's not actually a good approach. So that's kind of the change in mindset a little bit that's happening, which
Yeah.
is cool to see.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
when you talk, just to be clear, when you talk about embodied carbon, you're talking about the carbon impact of the way the materials are actually manufactured before you put
Right.
them into a building? Is that
Exactly. Yeah. So the full embodied carbon is in the materials and the construction for the whole life cycle. So even if you like replace the windows after 30 years, that would be technically part of the embodied carbon.
mm,
Now, the biggest chunk of the embodied carbon is what's called the upfront carbon. And the upfront carbon is that manufacturing, transportation to site, construction. Now, construction and transportation to site is like 5% of
mhm,
that upfront carbon. It's really about material manufacturing. That's really where the big emissions come from. So, aluminum is the worst of all kind of the materials in terms of its embodied carbon, at least. There's other benefits of aluminum, but yeah,
yeah.
that's what the embodied
It
carbon is.
it sounds like there's a lot of trade-offs. So, right, so you have to kind of
Yeah.
consider, right, all sides of everything. That's interesting. So, are there any projects that you have had the opportunity to work on that you can tell us a little bit about?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're actually building a school right now. It is our most kind of innovative school to date, I guess. It's on Vancouver Island. It's called South Langford Elementary, and it now when we start a school project, they're all kind of funded. Their directive is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from their operations. That's kind of a goal from the start, which gives us a great opportunity to do some stuff. So that school in particular, it's 4 stories. It's kind of embedded in almost like, it's not a cliff, but they blasted a ton of rock to be able to get this thing in the building. It's kind of that classic West Coast, um, you know, coniferous trees, rock
Uh,
shale, that kind of look.
mhm,
So it's kind of 4 stories. It's all mass timber. Both kind of the columns, the floor structure, the walls are even mass timber, which has a big impact on the embodied carbon of the building. So then this project also, it has a very low energy use. We used air source heat pumps and we electrified almost everything on the project. The domestic hot waters electrified, and then there's quite a large, I forget how big it is, I think it's like 90 kilowatt hour solar system on the roof as well.
wow.
So it's kind of got quite a bit of different stuff on it. And I think the EUI on that is supposed to be like 22, which is, a kind of a quarter lower than what a typical school would be, and that's partially from solar and partially just from the energy efficiency of the building and whatnot. So that's one of the really cool projects that we're working on. We're excited for that to be complete so we can get it out there a little bit more and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Wow, that sounds really exciting. So,
Mhm.
kind of thinking into the future, what do you see as some of the things that are coming down the pike that will really support that building sustainability for the long term?
Yeah, for sure. There's two things that I see coming. I mean, in British Columbia, we've got what's called a zero carbon step code. So what that is it's basically different steps on the ladder that municipalities can choose which step they want to hit. So the higher the step, the the lower carbon impact. So a city can actually say, "Hey, we want to target the highest," and then instead of waiting for the national building code to change, which takes 4 to 5 years, they can implement that right away. So what that's doing is it's pushing gas heating out of new buildings,
Mm,
specifically residential at this point. But it's yeah, that's one change that's coming that I see. The other one is in the retrofit side. So as I mentioned kind of earlier on, Vancouver's looking at starting to apply a carbon tax to existing buildings that have higher greenhouse gases emissions, and that's going to
mhm,
push a ton of retrofits for two reasons. One, because there's the tax, which is going to cost property owners money, and number two, because what's happening with electrification is that as we electrify, it's becoming harder for the electricity utilities to keep up with the electricity demand. So there's an energy efficiency that needs to happen too. So when you retrofit an existing building, it does two things. It reduces your carbon impact and it also reduces your energy use, which is really good for electric utilities. So those are kind of two of the things. I think embodied carbons, it's coming too. It seems like it's maybe a little bit slower right now, but I
mhm.
think I'm excited for that to come down a little bit more too. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. What are some of the things that you wish either developers or those that are working on either new build or retrofit construction projects, what do you wish they knew about sustainability?
Totally. I mean, one of the big things is a bit of a misconception is just about the cost of it. It doesn't have to cost a lot more. They studied a bunch of buildings here in Canada looking at zero carbon certification, which doesn't mean that they emit zero carbon. It just means they meet the certification, which means there are offsets in there and stuff like that. And,
Mhm.
and they were looking at like 1, 2, 3% increase in construction costs. The Passive House Institute has also done a lot of study on that, and it depends a lot on expertise of the contractor, to be honest. Um, and again, location factor. So you go to some places, and if you build a passive house, you have to put 10 times the amount of insulation on it. Other places you don't, because it depends a lot on the design of the building and the context for the building, what type of use it is, and those kind of things. So keeping all that context, I guess, in mind.
Mhm.
And what I wish happened a lot more is that more questions got asked, to be honest, because there's so much assumption, especially when people have been doing things for a long time. They're
Yeah.
like, we've been doing it for 20 years, therefore it works. Well, I'm not disagreeing that it works, but is there a better way or is there a different way? Or can we kind of open the door to that conversation? Because a lot of times, especially with kind of repeat clients, it's we're using this material because our maintenance teams have used it for 20 years and we're not switching. It's like, well, it's made of a terrible material. Would you consider it? And it's like, if they shut that down right away, that's kind of that hurts. It hampers kind of the progress, I guess, that we're looking to make.
Right, right. It seems like that's kind of a short-term attitude though, because I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of municipalities, state and local governments, and so on and so forth that, or provincial governments that
Mhm.
are putting, rules and regulations and, even tax credits and benefits as well in
Yeah.
place that, I think everybody's driving that direction, right? So you almost
Yeah,
don't have a
absolutely.
choice but to get with the times, right?
Right. And the reality is a lot of times maintenance departments run right. They determine what's put in a building. It's not actually the capital project teams. It's like, oh, what does our maintenance team need, right? So you have to make sure your whole group's aligned for the same purpose because sometimes we'll get the person who's leading the project, the capital manager or whatever, who might say, this is the direction we want to go. And then we'll talk to their operations team and they're like, no, we don't want to do that. That's going to cost us more here, or that's going to hurt this team here. So making sure your teams are aligned in terms of that bigger mission is also kind of a critical thing.
That is a really, really good point. Yeah, it's not just one decision maker, right? It's
No,
typically a
it's usually a
very large
whole
group.
totally, totally. And one of the interesting things too, which is a whole separate side, which is not my expertise, but I'm aware of, is that, we design things a certain way. The way they get operated is, that actually makes or breaks whether it's saving carbon. I mean, you can design the thing in a certain way. If the building operations team doesn't operate it the way it was intended to operate, or it's not calibrated properly, that can destroy all of the great benefits of the system. And I think that's one of the next steps that's coming too, is just aligning that better, the operations and the design, to make sure that things are continually calibrated and they make sure they're working properly, because these systems are way more sophisticated than they used to be, and they take a lot more fine tuning and all that kind of stuff. So
Excellent. Well, Stephen, I want to thank you so much for being here today and for filling that dead air that happened a little bit earlier. We
no
really
problem.
appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I really, really appreciate the conversation, and I think we just need to have more of this conversation, because I think it kind of helps everyone and encourage everyone to kind of make a difference and do their part.
Indeed. Well, we would love to have you come back on again and maybe talk about other projects that you're working on, and maybe we can dig into some of these topics a little bit deeper. So thank you for
That
making
sounds great.
time today.
Thanks, Lisa. Appreciate it.
Excellent. And I do want to take a moment to thank GuideForce for hosting these sessions. To learn more about GuideForce, you can visit guideforce.com. And we'll see you next time on the Startup Leader Show.